Hello, I'm the 10-minute English teacher. Let's get you exam ready. Today we're thinking about Romeo and Juliet, and I'm going to be providing a summary to Act 5. By the end of our time together, you'll understand the major events of Act 5, along with some of the key references from it. In front of you now are the major characters from Romeo and Juliet. If you're not familiar with them, feel free to check out my guide to the characters. Otherwise, we'll move on and we'll think about the major events of Act 5. Okay, in front of you, you've got images that represent the major events of Act 5. It's the end of the play, and quite a lot takes place. It's full of action, and by the end of our time, you should be able to explain what each of these images represents. Okay, so we start with Balthazar, who's got a fantastically strange name. By chance, or fate if you believe in it, a friend of Romeo's called Balthazar has heard news of Juliet's death and rushes to Mantua to tell him all about it. Romeo is not impressed. So it starts with Romeo getting this false information about Juliet that's clearly going to be the catalyst that leads to him taking his own life, as we were promised at the beginning in the prologue. We've then got Romeo heading off to buy himself some poison. So he plans to kill himself next to Juliet and heads to see an apothecary, which is a weird little man who makes potions. He pays the man for some poison to render himself dead. So that's how he's going to do it. He goes and gets his poison, and then he's on his way to see Juliet. Then we've got Paris being killed. It's quite interesting that that this is left out of certainly the Baz Luhrmann version of the film. I think they wanted to make that ending a little bit more tragic and sentimental, but ultimately this does actually paint quite an interesting picture of what kind of a character Romeo is. He's impulsive and he is proud, and he is a fiery character. He's associated with the motif of fire throughout the play. So when Romeo arrives at the tomb, Paris is there with the flowers that he was going to put on their wedding bed, and he's talking to himself about, how sad he is. He accuses Romeo, when Romeo's there, of coming to muck about with the dead bodies, so Romeo kills him. So Romeo kills Paris there and then. Then we've got the death of Romeo. So Romeo talks to himself about how beautiful Juliet is, frustrating the audience by talking about how it's hard to believe she's dead at all. Of course she's not. He then drinks the poison and dies. Then we've got Friar Lawrence turning up. Now he's headed there as quickly as he can do, because he realises that the letter that he'd sent to Romeo hasn't got there because one of the other members of his church hasn't managed to make the journey because of plague, I think it is. But ultimately, a letter that he'd sent doesn't get to Romeo, and Romeo therefore doesn't realise that Juliet is not dead. So he rushes down to the Capulet tomb where Juliet is, and when he gets there, he finds Romeo and Paris dead. And it's at that point that Juliet wakes up, but she refuses to come with him. Now, he's probably worried about getting in trouble. He is, after all, a bit feckless and a bit of a coward. So he scarpers and leaves her on her own, which is a terrible decision, but he's not really known for his great decision-making. So that's what happens there. Juliet, left alone, is unable to face a life without Romeo, and then she's annoyed that he hasn't left any poison for her. She stabs herself with a dagger and she dies. And then we've got the ending. So I've cut this up into two parts for you. So the first part is the prince turning up to find out what's gone on. There's somebody called the page who says, this is where the torches doth burn, where when he leads people down. If you want to sound really clever, that image of the burning torch is something that we associate with Romeo falling in love with Juliet. He says, oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. Maybe Shakespeare's borrowing that image to lace this with a little bit more tragedy. Friar Lawrence then explains the situation and apologises, and he says that he'll accept whatever punishment he has coming his way. So he's in trouble. And then we've got a reconciliation between the Capulets and the Montagues. So the play ends with the parents showing respect for each other and their now dead children. If only Romeo and Juliet had bothered speaking to them, and vice versa at the end. There are two ways of looking at the ending, which is why it's such a great play. You can either be frustrated by the fact that their reconciliation couldn't have come sooner, and you can place a little blame on the pride of the Montagues and Capulets. But ultimately, they're both very, very similar in many ways, and they did used to be friends, and the reason for them falling out is long forgotten. If only Juliet and Romeo had spoken to them, perhaps it could have been a completely different outcome for them. Okay, so those are the major events. You should understand what they all mean, and you should be able to recall exactly what happens in order. And that leads us to quotes to know for Act 5. So we've got Paris being killed. He says, here is come to do villainous shame to the dead body. So he thinks Romeo is there to do villainous shame. Make of that what you will. And interestingly, Romeo says, good, gentle youth, tempt not a desperate man. So we've got, interestingly, a bit of juxtaposition between youth and man there. This is a play about young people trying to be adults and failing miserably. You see that with Tybalt calling Romeo a boy earlier on in the play when they're in conflict, and calling Paris good, gentle youth and declaring himself a man is an interesting moment just before pride leads him to killing Paris. Ultimately, the idea of being manly and being an adult is something that young people find really hard to cope with in this play. Then we got the death of Romeo, and we've got some wonderful dramatic irony here. Death's pale flag is not advanced. This is Romeo saying, she doesn't look dead yet. And of course, that's, a wonderful moment. I like to imagine people in the late 1500s, shouting at the stage, like you would do in a pantomime, because he's about to kill himself and we know what he doesn't. She's not dead. And then he says, here's to my love, as he drinks the poison. And another sort of ironic sort of celebration taking place there. Ordinarily, people are, toasting weddings and celebrating marriages. Romeo's celebrating his death here. So Shakespeare really exploring the idea there's a fine line between comedy and tragedy. Juliet dies and she says, oh, happy dagger. Got a lovely bit of personification there, but also the idea of the dagger being happy. This sort of doesn't quite work here to reflect the confusion in Juliet at this point. Then we've got a page who says, there where the torch doth burn. So their bodies lie where the torch doth burn, which is that image of the torch has got, the motif of fire being loving but impulsive is being alluded to there. And it's also an image from when Romeo and Juliet fell in love earlier on in the play. And Friar Lawrence says that he will succumb to the rigour of the severest law. So he's going to accept whatever punishment is coming his way. So Shakespeare does place some blame on Friar Lawrence. Part of the resolution of the play is the audience walking away, understanding that Friar Lawrence has got it coming to him. And then we've got the reconciliation between Montague and Capulet. Montague says, I will raise her statue in pure gold. So, he wants to show some respect to Juliet, to Capulet, and they I think Capulet calls Montague brother in that moment as well. So that's really frustrating because everything was in place for these two to reconcile and for Romeo and Juliet to be able to be together. You can blame them and their pride and their circumstances, or you can blame Romeo and Juliet for not simply speaking to their parents. After all, Capulet showed respect to Romeo when Romeo was in his house uninvited. He called him a well-governed youth. For me, all of the ingredients were there on the table. All Juliet had to do was speak to her father about how she felt about Romeo. We could have had a completely different ending. And that leads us to you taking your revision further. So do feel free to have a look at all the other videos in the playlist and the other things that are on the channel for you to help you revise. But as far as Act 5 is concerned, can you recall the major events of Act 5? What do you think the outcome would have been if Juliet had spoken with her parents? Why might things have been different? How many of the key quotes can you recall? Revisit them and make flashcards, or just watch the video again and then test yourself at the end. So to end, there is the play in front of you. So this flashcard has got all the major events of Romeo and Juliet. I have provided a guide to the play in 10 minutes. So you have a look at that. But ultimately, how many of these key events from Romeo and Juliet can you recall? If you're able to explore all of these and explain what they are in order, you're well and truly ready for your exam, where you'll be able to explain lots of significant things that happen in Romeo and Juliet. Okay, check out the other videos on my channel. I'll continue to add content. Feel free to ask for something you'd like to see me cover in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share, and keep revising.